If you've wondered what it was like encountering wild horses for the first time in the Red Desert in Wyoming, and how I began photographing and advocating for them, stay tuned to find out. I'm your host, and I'm going to tell you more in this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. In 2000, I started my business, Living Images by Carol Walker, and the focus of the business was photographing horses. A few years later, friends asked me, why was I not photographing wild horses? And I said, wild horses? I don't know anything about wild horses. And then a week later, I received an invitation by email to go out to Wyoming and photograph wild horses. I immediately agreed, and then in April of 2004, I went out to Wyoming to go see wild horses. I'm in the passenger seat of a pickup truck, heading down a dirt road outside of the very small town of Baggs, Wyoming. And we pass the dump, and then on my right, there's a rock formation with striated patterns of tan and red and blue rising up to form a tall hill. And the road is dry, dusty, and deserted. And we drive for what feels like a very long time. There's sagebrush growing on hills and on flats as far as my eyes can see. It's April, and the green is starting to show on the tops of the sagebrush, and the brown grass has some little green sprouts coming through. I'm told to look for a yellow cattle guard with a twisted side, because that marks the beginning of the herd management area where the wild horses roam. And soon we go over that cattle guard and then over a wooden bridge that spans a long, dry riverbed. Adobe Town is located in the desert of Wyoming. And this is a high-altitude desert and sagebrush steppe. It's also known as the Big Empty. And it's about 9,320 square miles, which is almost 6 million acres. The majority of this area is public land, managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And there's wildlife throughout this area, even as dry as it is. And it hosts the largest herd of pronghorn and the largest herd of rare desert elk. And smaller animals and birds, and of course wild horses, all live and thrive there. The landscape is vast, and it's very rugged. There's buttes and arroyos, mesas, and hoodoos. And Adobe Town is one of the 5 wild horse herd management areas in the Red Desert, and it's almost 500,000 acres in size. And as we drive, I begin to appreciate how vast the land is, and how little of it we've traversed in over an hour of driving. We go down several 2 tracks, which are just as they sound, 2 parallel tracks where the tires go. And some are rutted and bumpy, and others are smoother. And we begin to see wild horses. I see white in the distance, and sometimes the groups of horses, as soon as they see the truck, they take off running. Some of them at a distance just watch, and we keep driving. And the horses are very beautiful. They come in all different colors. There's white, sorrel, bay, black, red roan, strawberry roan, blue roan. And it's amazing to me to see these healthy horses out in the middle of this dry landscape that I never would think before would support all this wildlife. As we drive, we go around a bend, and I see a beautiful white mare standing. And around her, I see ears sticking up out of the sagebrush. It looks like there's a family of wild horses lying down taking a nap. And they're sheltering from the wind, which is pretty present all the time in Wyoming. And I grab my camera and I button up my coat because it's cold. And my fingers are fumbling with the buttons because I'm so excited. I can't wait to get out of the truck. And I leave the door ajar because I don't want to startle the horses. I start walking slowly toward them, and all of a sudden, a gray horse with a charcoal mane lunges to his feet and begins running toward me. I realize that this must be the stallion. As he gets closer and closer to me, I wonder if he's going to stop. And then I also wonder what I'm going to do if he doesn't. As the stallion approaches, more horses behind him unfold their bodies and rise up from the sagebrush. I see 2 fillies. One's a gawky yearling, and the other is a sturdier 2-year-old. I stand very, very still, and only my fingers are moving as I click the shutter on my camera. The stallion slows to a trot and then stops about 10 feet away from me. I finally start breathing normally, thrilled to see him so close. He's downwind of me so he can smell me. He seems to be inspecting me as avidly as I am him, and he has many bite marks and scars sprinkled across his white coat. I can tell that he's an older stallion. Gray horses start their lives darker in color and then lighten as they age. And he's also clearly a veteran of many battles to protect his family. And then once he's gotten a good look at me, he seems to relax. And then he strolls over to the younger of the 2 fillies who are standing together, and they're also looking at me. These sisters look very much alike. They both have these long, straight blazes on their faces, but the younger filly's blaze tapers between her eyes like an hourglass. She's a reddish color, but her coat will lighten and turn white like her mother's and father's coats. The stallion stops right next to her, and he affectionately nuzzles her. And then she nuzzles him right back. Then he walks over to the older filly, whose color is lighter than hers, and he nuzzles her. She lifts her head, and she shows her teeth, almost like she was grinning at me. I laugh, and luckily the horses don't seem to care that I make so much noise. The beautiful pure white mare hangs back and watches her daughter's antics. And her belly is huge, with looks like this year's coming full. And I wonder when she's going to have it. I watch for a while and take pictures. And then I didn't really want to interfere too much with their morning's activities. So I leave when they show signs of becoming restless. And we drive on and find another group of horses. That first day, I counted probably 200 horses that we saw, and most of them were too far away to really get a good picture of, but some of them were curious and came closer. I was absolutely enchanted by my experience with these horses, and I decided that I was going to go out and keep coming back and seeing them and spending time with them. So the next month in May, I headed out to Adobe Town. And I looked for this beautiful family that I had spent time with. And I find them down a hill in a draw. And it was a good place to shelter from the wind. And the white mare's belly is absolutely huge. And she looks very uncomfortable. And I'm thinking there's a foal there ready to be born. And I think it's going to happen very soon. I head back into town. And when I go back out the next morning, I go to the same area and I look for her and I look for the whole family and I don't see them. But as I drive along the road, I see a flash of white and there's the family. They're in the sagebrush and the fillies are lying down next to their mother and there's a new foal. He's very unsteady on his feet and he leans down to cuddle up with his mother. And I approach slowly and the stallion walks toward me. He goes downwind of me, and then he relaxes and goes back to eating. And I feel such a sense of gratitude that this family trusts me enough to allow me to stay with them when they have a newborn foal with them. Over time, I keep going out to Adobe Town and visiting the families that I've met, and I find new horses every time I go out there. There's a red roan stallion that I saw, and he has a red roan mare, a black mare with a gorgeous tangled mane and beautiful eyes, and a black foal. And the first time I saw them, the mares took off up the hill, and the stallion kept looking behind him to see if I was following them. But the next time I went out there, they were more accepting, and they didn't run away, and the stallion seemed to accept having me around. And every time I went out there, I would see this family, usually pretty close to the road. And the stallion looked like he was an older stallion and pretty patient with his family. I went out during the winter as well, which was an amazing experience because Adobe Town is gorgeous when there's snow blanketing the mesas and the buttes. And Kinney Rim is this gorgeous rim that had snow all over it. And I saw a white stallion and his family run in front of the rim. And they seemed really at home, even though the winters can be very cold out there. They grow long coats to protect them, and they're able to dig through the snow to get to the grass and continue to forage during the winter. The next spring, I went out, and then I heard that there was going to be a roundup. And I didn't know what that meant. I just heard that the Bureau of Land Management was going to remove over half of the horses in Adobe Town. I didn't know why, but I decided that I wanted to go to the roundup and witness it for myself so I would know what was going to happen to these horses that I'd come to know and love over the past year and a half. And the Coutures are a company, a contractor that does the roundups usually in Wyoming. And they use a helicopter and they chase the horses with the helicopter, and the horses run because they're afraid. And they run into a trap, and there is a Judas horse, he's called, who's trained to run into the trap and lead the horses there. So I spent 4 days watching horses that I had gotten to know being driven into the trap and be separated. The minute that they go into the trap, the mares are separated from the stallions and the foals are separated from the mares. I found out later that 16 of these foals were under 3 months old and too young to be separated from their mothers. And they actually had to find foster parents for these foals to keep them alive. There was the sound of whinnying and stallions fighting and grunting in the pens, and the foals were whinnying for their mothers, and the mothers were whinnying for the foals. And every time any person approached the pens where the horses were, they were panicked. And it was one of the saddest sights I can remember seeing. I got to go up on this rock formation and watch every time the helicopter brought a family in. And they were funneled through on either side. There was burlap on fencing, which kept the horses going on the track that they wanted them to go. And then the helicopter would chase them into the pens, and then they would immediately start sorting them. I also watched them drive the horses one by one into a squeeze chute so that they could tell the age and mark that down and know. And they would also put paint on the rear ends of the horses, saying whether the horses would be let go or whether they would be transported away. Initially, the plan, I heard, was that the older horses would be released back into the area because the horses over 10, they are least likely to find adopters. And then, about halfway through, I heard that these older horses were now going to go to supposed sanctuaries in Oklahoma, meaning long-term holding facilities. And the red-roan stallion, who they had aged at 22 years old and were going to release him, he was now going to be loaded onto a trailer and trucked to Oklahoma, losing his freedom forever. I was absolutely heartbroken. This was probably the worst part of the roundup so far, because I had been counting on that he was going to be able to live out his life in his home, and now that wasn't the case. They said they had 100 spots for these older horses, and the horses over 10 could be sold without limitation, meaning someone could buy a whole bunch of them from the holding facility by the truckload, and these horses could end up at slaughter. And this is the very worst thing about a roundup, is that these horses belong in the wild. They belong in their homes, where they're suited to the terrain and the lives that they live with their families, and they're taken away from that and put into short-term corrals where they're just feedlots. And some of them are lucky enough to end up at pastures, but they're all in jeopardy of ending up at slaughter. I, at the end of the roundup, was not even able to look at my photographs for probably 4 months. It was so wrenching to know that these horses that I'd gotten to know over the past year and a half, most of them were gone. And the land clearly could support all 1,200 horses that had been there. And now there were less than 600 left. At this point, I realized that just taking pictures of wild horses was not enough. I was going to have to be able to help them. I wanted people to see what I had seen. I wanted them to know what I knew, which is these horses are magnificent. They're free. They have families. They have relationships, sometimes going back 10 years with the mares and the stallions. They're healthy. They're not starving to death. They're not dying of thirst. They belong on our public lands. So I decided I was going to do whatever I could to help these horses. And I decided to do a book and show people that these horses are amazing. And photographs can make a huge difference. Photographs are one of the most powerful tools there are to communicate a message and to illuminate a situation. They provide a window into another world that can draw people in and can elicit an emotional response. When people care, they become motivated to help and to support a cause. And that's what these wild horses needed. So, as upsetting as my photographs of the roundup were, they shed light for people on how devastating the actions of the federal agency charged with managing wild horses, the Bureau of Land Management, could be on these sensitive and beautiful creatures. My photos showing horses running in fear from helicopters with terror in their eyes make much more of an impact than a written description. And the photographs of the families, the mares being tender with their foals, the stallions protective of their families, the horses in excellent condition going into winter. All of these things were important to see. So I did my first book, Wild Hoofbeats, America's Vanishing Wild Horses. And I used that book to show people the story of the horses from Adobe Town and what happens to the wild horses when they're rounded up and why we should fight for them and why we should protect them. My questions were these. If the horses are thriving on our public lands and they belong there, according to the 1971 Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. Why were they being rounded up? Why were they being removed? Why were they being warehoused like livestock? And the answer is there's a powerful lobby in Congress, the livestock lobby, the ag lobby, that wants the horses gone and scapegoats them for any degradation of the range. And I really thought back at the time of the roundup and when I did the book that in a few years, wild horses would be fine. We'd see them protected. They'd stop the roundups. They'd use birth control to manage their numbers instead of helicopter roundups. But that didn't happen. Here we are, 2023, and wild horses are more in jeopardy than they ever have been. So I don't say that my efforts haven't made a difference. I say my efforts have brought attention to thousands of people across the country and in the world of the plight of wild horses, and so many people have become involved. And social media has been a tremendous help in spreading the word about wild horses. And when people see photographs of how magnificent they are, they want to go out and see them. They want to preserve them so that their children can see them. And I think that's really my task, my goal, is to show that people need the tonic of wildness that these wild horses give. And I always tell people, get out there and see these horses while you can. See them while they're still there. There's nothing like sitting down in the sagebrush. It's so quiet and peaceful, and watching a family of wild horses take their mid-morning nap and then wake up and the foals start nursing and the stallions may decide that they want to breed one of their mares and they start moving around and then they go to graze or they go to water. There's no feeling like it. There's no sight like it. And we, the American people, own these horses. These are our horses. These are our public lands. We should be the ones determining what happens to our wild horses. And so in this episode, I talked about my experience getting to know wild horses, having the shock of going through my first roundup, and learning to speak out and educate people, and learning the value of photographs to communicate a message that can move people to take action. My book, Wild Hoofbeats, can be found on my website at www.wildhoofbeats.com. And thank you for tuning in to this episode today. To celebrate the launch of the show, I'm going to be giving away a 12-inch by 18-inch metal print of Blue Zeus called Into the Blue and 2 signed copies of my book, Blue Zeus, Legend of the Red Desert. I'm going to be giving them away to 3 lucky listeners who follow, rate, and review the show. Now, it doesn't have to be a 5-star review, although I sure hope you love the show. I really want your honest feedback so I can create an awesome show that provides tons of value. Visit www.wildhoofbeats.com/podcast launch to learn more about the contest and how to enter. I'll be announcing the winners on the show in episode 10. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.